The morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac at Kandahar Airfield as Captain Sarah Martinez walked toward the briefing tent. Her flight suit was crisp, her helmet tucked under her arm, and her stride confident despite the weight of what lay ahead. Few people paid her much attention as she moved through the busy base. To most, she was just another pilot heading to another mission briefing. Sarah had learned long ago that being invisible sometimes worked in her favor. In a world dominated by men, especially in combat aviation, she had discovered that surprise could be her greatest weapon. Not the kind of surprise that came from aerial maneuvers or tactical strikes, but the surprise that flickered across faces when people realized what she was capable of. Born in a small Texas town, where Friday night football was religion, and women were expected to be cheerleaders, not quarterbacks, Sarah had always been different. While other girls played with dolls, she built model airplanes. While they dreamed of prom dresses, she dreamed of cockpits. Her father, a Vietnam veteran who flew helicopters, had recognized something special in his daughter early on. He never told her she couldn't do something because she was a girl. Instead, he taught her to fly before she could legally drive. The path to becoming a combat pilot had been anything but easy. The Air Force Academy had tested her in ways she never imagined. Physical training that left her muscles screaming. Academic challenges that kept her awake for days. And social pressures that tried to break her spirit. Some instructors doubted her abilities simply because of her gender. Others pushed her harder, expecting her to fail. Sarah used their doubt as fuel, turning every skeptical look into motivation. During her first year at the academy, an upperclassman had cornered her after a particularly brutal training session. "You know you don't belong here, right?" he had sneered. "This isn't a place for playing dress-up." Sarah had looked him straight in the eye and replied, "Then I guess you better get used to being beaten by someone playing dress-up." She graduated third in her class. Flight school brought new challenges. The T-6 Texan trainer felt like a wild horse the first time she climbed into the cockpit. Her hands trembled slightly as she went through the pre-flight checklist, not from fear, but from pure excitement. This was what she had dreamed of since she was 8 years old, watching her father's helicopter disappear into the horizon. Her first instructor, Major Tom Rodriguez, was a gruff man who had flown Aten seconds in Iraq. He had a reputation for washing out pilots who didn't meet his standards. On Sarah's first flight, he put the aircraft through maneuvers that would have made most people sick. Sarah gritted her teeth and flew with precision that surprised even herself. When they landed, Rodriguez pulled off his helmet and studied her face. "Not bad for a rookie," he said, which was the highest praise anyone had heard him give. "But, can you handle combat?" That question would follow Sarah through advanced training, through her assignment to the F-16 Fighting Falcon program, and eventually to her deployment to Afghanistan. Could she handle combat? The answer came during her third week in country. The mission was supposed to be routine. Provide close air support for a Marine unit conducting a sweep operation in Helmand Province. Sarah had flown similar missions before, always with experienced pilots leading the formation. This time, she was wing leader for a rookie pilot on his first combat mission. The Marines had walked into an ambush. The radio crackled with urgent calls for air support as enemy fire erupted from multiple positions. Sarah's training kicked in as she rolled her F-16 into an attack run, her hands steady on the controls despite the ground fire streaking past her canopy. She delivered her ordnance with surgical precision, silencing enemy positions and saving Marine lives. When she landed back at base, the ground crew was waiting. Word had already spread about her performance. The crew chief, a crusty sergeant who had been working on fighters for 20 years, walked up to her aircraft as she powered down. "Heard you saved some Marines today, Captain," he said, extending his hand. "That's what we call a real pilot." From that day forward, Sarah earned respect not because of her gender, but despite it. She flew missions that others called impossible, always bringing her aircraft and her wingman home safely. Her call sign became Viper, not because she flew Vipers, but because of her deadly accuracy in combat. The other pilots in her squadron learned to trust her judgment. During pre-mission briefings, they would often defer to her tactical expertise. Squadron Commander Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, a man who had initially been skeptical about women in combat roles, became one of her strongest supporters. "Martinez doesn't fly like a woman or like a man," he once told a visiting general. "She flies like a warrior." But even with all her success, Sarah still faced moments that reminded her how different she was. During squadron parties, conversations would sometimes stop when she approached. In the dining hall, tables of male pilots might lower their voices when discussing certain topics. She had learned to navigate these social minefields with grace, never letting the awkwardness affect her performance. Her roommate, Captain Lisa Chang, was one of the few people who understood the unique pressures Sarah faced. Lisa was an intelligence officer who had her own battles with gender stereotypes in the military. They would often sit up late talking about the challenges of proving themselves in a man's world. "Sometimes I wonder if we have to be twice as good just to be considered half as capable," Lisa had said one night after a particularly difficult day. "Then we'll be twice as good," Sarah had replied. "And when we're done, they'll wish they were half as capable as us." The conversation that would change everything began 3 months into Sarah's deployment. She had been selected to attend a joint operations briefing, where different branches of the military would coordinate upcoming missions. The meeting was held in a large tent on the base, with representatives from the Army, Marines, Navy, and Air Force present. Sarah took a seat near the back, her notebook ready and her mind focused on the intelligence reports they would review. She noticed several Navy SEALs sitting together near the front, their quiet confidence evident even in a crowded room. SEALs had a reputation for being the elite of the elite, and their presence suggested that whatever operation they were planning would be significant. The briefing covered routine operations for the next week, but Sarah sensed there was something more important coming. The tension in the room was palpable, and several senior officers kept checking their watches. Finally, a Navy captain she didn't recognize stood up and moved to the front of the tent. Captain David Torres was a SEAL with 20 years of experience in special operations. His weathered face bore the marks of countless missions in hostile territory, and his calm demeanor commanded immediate respect. Sarah had heard stories about Torres, how he had led rescue missions deep behind enemy lines, how he had trained some of the most elite operators in the military. "Ladies and gentlemen," Torres began, his voice carrying easily across the tent, "I need to discuss a time-sensitive operation that requires immediate attention." The room fell silent. Sarah leaned forward, her pen poised over her notebook. Whatever Torres was about to say, it was important enough to interrupt a routine briefing. Torres moved to a large map mounted on an easel and pointed to a remote valley in the Hindu Kush Mountains. 12 hours ago, a reconnaissance team went dark in this area. We have reason to believe they're pinned down by enemy forces and need immediate extraction. Sarah studied the map, noting the treacherous terrain and the distance from the nearest friendly forces. Any rescue mission would be extremely dangerous, requiring precise coordination and exceptional flying skills. "The problem," Torres continued, "is the location. The valley is surrounded by peaks over 12,000 feet, with unpredictable wind patterns and frequent cloud cover. Standard helicopter extraction is not possible due to enemy anti-aircraft weapons in the area." Sarah's heart began to race. She could see where this was heading. "We need a pilot capable of flying low-level attack missions to suppress enemy positions before our ground team can move in for extraction," Torres said. "But not just any pilot. This mission requires someone with exceptional skills, someone who can navigate mountain terrain in adverse conditions while engaging multiple targets." The room remained silent. Sarah looked around and noticed that several pilots were avoiding eye contact with Torres. She understood why. This was the kind of mission that could go wrong in a dozen different ways, the kind that ended careers or lives. Torres scanned the room, his eyes moving from face to face. "The window for this operation is narrow. We need to move within the next 6 hours, or we risk losing our people entirely." Sarah felt the weight of the moment. Somewhere in those mountains, American servicemen were counting on their fellow warriors to bring them home. The risks were enormous, but the alternative was unthinkable. Torres took a deep breath and asked the question that would change everything. "I need to know right now," he said, his voice carrying the urgency of the situation. Any combat pilots in here who think they can handle this mission? The silence stretched on, heavy with the weight of responsibility and fear. Sarah looked around the tent, watching as experienced pilots shifted uncomfortably in their seats. She understood their hesitation. This wasn't the kind of mission anyone volunteered for lightly. But as she sat there, thinking about those men trapped in the mountains, something inside her began to burn. This was why she had fought so hard to become a combat pilot. This was why she had endured the doubt, the skepticism, and the constant pressure to prove herself. Not for the easy missions or the routine sorties, but for moments like this, when everything was on the line. Sarah Martinez closed her notebook and prepared to stand, knowing that her next action would surprise everyone in that tent, including herself. The silence in the briefing tent seemed to stretch forever. Captain Torres stood at the front, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement, any indication that someone would step forward for what was clearly a suicide mission. The map behind him showed the treacherous terrain where American lives hung in the balance. Sarah felt her heart pounding against her ribs. Around her, she could sense the tension of pilots wrestling with their consciences, weighing duty against survival instinct. These weren't cowards. They were experienced combat aviators who understood exactly what Torres was asking for. The mission he described wasn't just dangerous. It was the kind of operation that military families would remember in their nightmares. Major Rick Sullivan, a veteran F-16 pilot sitting 3 rows ahead, shifted nervously in his seat. Sarah had flown with Sullivan before and knew him to be competent and brave, but she could see the calculation in his posture. He had a wife and 2 young daughters back in Colorado. Captain Mike Thompson, an A-10 pilot known for his aggressive flying style, stared at his hands without making eye contact with Torres. Even the Marine pilots, notorious for their willingness to take on impossible missions, seemed frozen in their chairs. Torres waited another few seconds, then began to nod slowly, the disappointment evident on his weathered face. "I understand," he said quietly. "This isn't an easy thing to ask." That's when Sarah Martinez stood up. The scraping of her chair against the concrete floor seemed unnaturally loud in the silent tent. Every head turned toward her, and she felt the weight of dozens of stares pressing down on her shoulders. For a moment, the only sound was the distant hum of generators and the far-off roar of jets taking off from the main runway. Torres's eyes widened slightly as he took in the sight of the relatively small figure now standing at the back of the tent. Sarah wasn't physically imposing. She stood 5 feet 6 inches tall and weighed barely 130 pounds. Her flight suit, while properly fitted, still seemed to hang loosely on her frame. But there was something in her posture, something in the set of her jaw, that commanded attention. "Captain Martinez, F-16 pilot, sir," she said, her voice clear and steady despite the churning in her stomach. "I can handle the mission." The reaction was immediate and electric. Heads swiveled back and forth between Sarah and Torres, as if the assembled officers couldn't quite process what they had just witnessed. Major Sullivan turned completely around in his chair to stare at her. Captain Thompson's mouth fell open slightly. Even the usually stoic Marine pilots looked stunned. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, Sarah's squadron commander, felt his pulse quicken. He had always known Martinez was special, but this was something else entirely. The mission Torres had described would challenge the most experienced pilots in the theater. The fact that she was volunteering, without hesitation, spoke to either incredible courage or dangerous overconfidence. Colonel James Peterson, the senior Air Force officer present, leaned forward in his chair near the front of the tent. He had been in the military for 28 years and had seen plenty of young pilots volunteer for missions beyond their capabilities. But there was something different about Martinez's demeanor that gave him pause. She wasn't posturing or showing off. She simply looked ready. Torres studied Sarah's face for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He had worked with enough elite operators to recognize genuine confidence when he saw it. But this situation was unprecedented. In all his years leading special operations, he had never had a female pilot volunteer for a mission this dangerous. "Captain," Torres said carefully, "I appreciate your willingness to step forward, but I need to be sure you understand what this mission entails." Sarah took a step forward, moving into the aisle between the rows of chairs. "Sir, I understand perfectly." You need someone who can fly, nap of the earth through mountain terrain, engage multiple ground targets with precision weapons, and provide close air support for an extraction team in hostile territory with limited visibility and unpredictable weather conditions. The clinical way she summarized the mission requirements sent a ripple of murmurs through the tent. This wasn't bravado. This was a professional assessment delivered with the kind of calm confidence that comes from genuine competence. Torres nodded slowly. That's correct, Captain. But I should also mention that the enemy forces in the area include at least 3 known anti-aircraft positions, possibly more. The terrain will require flying at extremely low altitude, which means limited time to react to ground fire. Weather reports indicate possible storm activity moving through the area within the next 8 hours. Understood, sir, Sarah replied without hesitation. What aircraft will be available? The question surprised many in the tent. Most pilots, when faced with such a dangerous mission, would focus on the risks. Sarah was already moving to operational planning. Major Rodriguez, Sarah's former flight instructor who was now stationed at the same base, felt a surge of pride mixed with fear. He had always known Martinez was extraordinary, but watching her step forward when no one else would reminded him why he had pushed her so hard during training. She had the kind of instinct that couldn't be taught. Torres gestured toward a younger SEAL sitting near the front. Lieutenant Commander Jack Morgan will brief you on available assets and mission specifics, Captain. But first, I need to ask you directly, why are you volunteering for this? Sarah met his gaze steadily. Because there are Americans trapped in those mountains, sir. And because I'm the best pilot for this mission. The simple honesty of her response sent another wave of surprise through the tent. She wasn't boasting. She was stating what she believed to be fact. Several pilots who had initially been shocked by her volunteering began to nod slightly. They had flown with Martinez before and knew her reputation. Commander Morgan stood up and moved to join Torres at the front. He was younger than Torres, probably in his early 30s, with the lean build and alert eyes of someone who had spent years in special operations. Captain Martinez, he said, I've reviewed the personnel files for all pilots currently at this base. Your combat record is impressive. Sarah remained silent, waiting for him to continue. 14 combat missions, all successful. Morgan read from a folder in his hands. 0 aircraft losses, 0 friendly fire incidents, consistently rated as exceeding expectations by ground forces you've supported. Your squadron commander's evaluation notes, exceptional flying skills under extreme conditions, and tactical decision-making superior to pilots with twice her experience. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison felt his chest swell with pride. He had written those evaluations himself, and every word was true. But hearing them read aloud in this context made him realize just how extraordinary his pilot really was. Morgan continued reading. Commendation for actions during Operation Mountain Storm, where you provided close air support for a Marine unit under heavy fire. Citation reads, Captain Martinez displayed exceptional courage and flying skill, conducting multiple attack runs in adverse weather conditions against determined enemy resistance, directly saving the lives of 12 Marines. Captain Lisa Chang, Sarah's roommate, was sitting near the back of the tent for the intelligence briefing portion of the meeting. She watched her friend standing calmly in the aisle and felt a mixture of admiration and terror. She had seen Sarah prepare for dangerous missions before, but nothing like this. Torres nodded as Morgan finished reading the file. Impressive record, Captain. But this mission is different from anything you've done before. The terrain alone makes it extremely dangerous, even without enemy action. Sarah's response was immediate. Sir, I've studied every mountain approach in this theater. I know the wind patterns, the thermal conditions, and the visual landmarks. I've flown similar terrain in training exercises at Nellis and in the Colorado Rockies. Her confident response drew more murmurs from the assembled officers. Major Sullivan, who had been one of her first doubters, found himself nodding in recognition. He remembered Martinez spending hours studying topographical maps and weather patterns that other pilots ignored. Torres exchanged a glance with Morgan, then looked back at Sarah. Very well, Captain. You have the mission. But I want to be absolutely clear about the timeline and expectations. The tent fell silent again as Torres moved back to the map. The reconnaissance team went dark at 0300 hours local time. We estimate they have enough supplies to last another 18 hours maximum, assuming they're not seriously wounded. Sarah nodded, already calculating fuel requirements and flight times in her head. The extraction site is here, Torres continued, pointing to a narrow valley surrounded by peaks. The team will attempt to reach this location, approximately 2 clicks from where we lost contact. Your job is to clear the area of enemy resistance and provide cover while our ground team moves in. Morgan stepped forward with additional details. Intelligence indicates at least 30 enemy fighters in the immediate area, with possible reinforcements moving in from the south. They have small arms, RPGs, and at least 3 heavy machine gun positions that could pose a threat to helicopters. Sarah studied the map intently, noting approach routes and potential targets. What kind of ordnance will be available? Standard loadout for close air support, Torres replied. AGM-65 Maverick missiles, 20mm cannon, and a mix of GPS-guided bombs. You'll also carry marking rockets for target designation. The conversation was becoming increasingly technical, and Sarah felt herself settling into the familiar rhythm of mission planning. This was her element: analyzing threats, planning approaches, calculating risks and benefits. Major Harrison stood up from his position near the front. "Captain Martinez," he said, his voice carrying the authority of her commanding officer, "I want you to understand that if you have any doubts about this mission, now is the time to express them. There's no shame in reconsidering." Sarah looked at her squadron commander, the man who had supported her career and defended her against critics. She saw genuine concern in his eyes, but also trust. "Sir, I have no doubts about my ability to complete this mission successfully." Torres nodded approvingly. "Good. Then let's talk about support assets." Over the next 30 minutes, the briefing evolved into a detailed operational planning session. Sarah found herself at the center of a circle of senior officers, each contributing expertise in their area. The Marine representatives provided intelligence on enemy tactics. The Navy SEALs outlined their extraction plan. The Air Force officers coordinated air traffic control and fuel requirements. Throughout the discussion, Sarah demonstrated a level of tactical knowledge that impressed even the most senior officers present. She asked pointed questions about enemy capabilities, suggested modifications to the approach route based on her knowledge of mountain flying conditions, and identified potential complications that others had missed. Colonel Peterson, who had been observing quietly, finally spoke up. "Captain Martinez, I have one final question. In your professional opinion, what are the odds of successfully completing this mission?" The tent fell silent as everyone waited for her answer. Sarah thought for a moment, considering all the variables they had discussed. The terrain, the weather, the enemy forces, the time constraints. "Sir, if everything goes according to plan, I'd estimate about 70% chance of complete success," she said finally. "But missions like this never go according to plan. Realistically, I'd say we have about a 50-50 chance of getting everyone home safely." Her honest assessment sent a chill through the tent. 50% odds on a military mission were not good. Most operations required at least an 80% probability of success before being approved. Torres studied her face carefully. "And you're willing to accept those odds?" Sarah looked around the tent at all the faces watching her. Pilots who had been too afraid to volunteer. Officers who doubted her capabilities. Friends who were terrified for her safety. Then she thought about the reconnaissance team trapped in the mountains, probably wondering if anyone would come for them. "Sir," she said quietly, "those men in the mountains are facing much worse odds than 50-50 if we don't try. And I believe I can improve our chances significantly with proper execution." Torres nodded slowly, then extended his hand. "Captain Martinez, you have the mission. May God watch over you." As Sarah shook the SEAL captain's hand, she felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. In less than 4 hours, she would be flying alone into some of the most dangerous territory in Afghanistan, facing odds that had made veteran pilots hesitate. But as she looked around the tent one more time, seeing the mixture of admiration, fear, and hope in the faces around her, she felt something else too. She felt ready. 4 hours later, Sarah Martinez stood beside her F-16 Fighting Falcon on the darkened tarmac of Kandahar airfield. The pre-dawn air was crisp and thin, carrying the scent of jet fuel and the distant smell of mountains. Her aircraft had been loaded with precision-guided munitions specifically chosen for the mission ahead. AGM-65 Maverick missiles for hardened targets, 20mm cannon rounds for close support, and GPS-guided bombs for area denial. Staff Sergeant Mike Chen, her crew chief, performed final checks on the external stores. Chen had been working on fighters for 15 years, and Sarah could see the worry etched in his weathered face as he inspected each weapon system. He had prepared aircraft for dangerous missions before, but never one where the pilot faced such overwhelming odds. "Everything checks out perfect, Captain," Chen said as he climbed down from the wing. "All systems green, full fuel load, and enough ordnance to level a small city." He paused, then added quietly, "You bring my airplane back in one piece. You hear?" Sarah smiled and patted him on the shoulder. "Wouldn't dream of disappointing you." Sergeant Chen. Lieutenant Commander Morgan approached across the tarmac, carrying a secure radio and a folder containing updated intelligence reports. Behind him walked Captain Torres, who, despite his confident demeanor during the briefing, now showed signs of the stress that came with sending someone into extreme danger. "Latest satellite imagery, Captain," Morgan said, handing her the folder. "Enemy positions confirmed, but we're seeing additional movement in the area. Possible reinforcements arriving from the north." Sarah studied the photos under her flashlight, noting new vehicle positions and what appeared to be additional anti-aircraft weapons. The mission had just become more dangerous, but the intelligence also revealed potential weaknesses in the enemy deployment. "They're spreading themselves thin," she observed, pointing to gaps in the defensive perimeter. "If I approach from the southeast and use this ridgeline for cover, I can hit their main positions before they can coordinate a response." Torres nodded, impressed once again by her tactical thinking. "The extraction team will be in position at the landing zone 30 minutes after you begin your attack. We need those enemy positions suppressed long enough for the helicopters to get in and out." "Understood, sir," Sarah replied, already visualizing her attack runs. "What's the latest on weather?" Morgan checked his notes. "Storm front moving in faster than predicted. You'll have about a 2-hour window of clear conditions, then visibility drops to near zero. If we can't get the extraction done in that time frame, we'll have to abort until the weather clears." Sarah nodded grimly. The time pressure had just intensified, but there was no choice. The reconnaissance team wouldn't survive another 24 hours without resupply. Major Harrison arrived in a jeep with Sarah's final mission documents and communication codes. As her squadron commander, he had argued against allowing her to fly the mission solo, but higher command had overruled him. There simply weren't enough qualified pilots available for a 2-ship formation. "Martinez," Harrison said as he handed over the paperwork, "I want you to know that regardless of what happens today, you've already proven yourself beyond any doubt. Don't take unnecessary risks trying to be a hero." Sarah understood what he wasn't saying. If the mission went badly, if she found herself overwhelmed by enemy fire, she had permission to abort and return to base. No one would question her judgment or courage. "Sir, I'll complete the mission and bring everyone home," she said simply. 20 minutes later, Sarah strapped into her cockpit as the eastern sky began to show the first hint of dawn. The familiar routine of pre-flight checks helped calm her nerves and focus her mind. Radio check, flight controls, engine parameters, weapon systems. Everything. Exactly as it should be. Tower control cleared her for takeoff, and Sarah felt the familiar surge of power as her F-16's engine pushed her down the runway and into the lightening sky. As the airfield fell away beneath her, she turned southeast toward the mountains that held both enemy forces and trapped Americans. The flight to the target area took 38 minutes, during which Sarah reviewed her attack plan and monitored intelligence updates from the ground. The reconnaissance team had managed to make contact briefly, confirming their position and reporting that they were under intermittent fire from multiple directions. As the Hindu Kush Mountains rose ahead of her, Sarah dropped to low altitude and began weaving between the peaks. The terrain was even more challenging than the maps had suggested. Jagged ridgelines, sudden valleys, and wind currents that tried to throw her aircraft into the rock faces on either side. Viper 1, this is Overwatch, came Torres's voice through her headset. Target area is 5 minutes ahead. Latest thermal imaging shows concentrated activity around the 3 main positions we briefed. Copy, Overwatch, Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the turbulence buffeting her aircraft. Beginning, final approach. She crested a ridgeline and suddenly the enemy positions were spread out below her. The intelligence had been accurate. 3 main defensive positions arranged in a triangle around the valley where the extraction would take place, but Sarah could also see additional fighters moving between the positions. More than the 30 they had estimated. Overwatch. Viper 1, she called. I count at least 50 enemy fighters, possibly more. They're better organized than we thought. Torres's voice came back tense. Can you still complete the mission? Sarah was already lining up her first attack run. Affirmative, Overwatch. Beginning engagement now. She rolled inverted and pulled into a steep dive toward the eastern position. Her targeting computer locking onto what appeared to be a heavy machine gun emplacement. The Maverick missile leaped from her wing and streaked toward the target, exploding in a ball of fire that sent enemy fighters scattering. But even as she pulled up from her first attack, green tracers were already reaching toward her aircraft. The enemy had been ready for air attack, and their response was immediate and coordinated. Sarah jinked left and right, using the mountain terrain to break their targeting. Then came around for a second pass at the northern position. This time she used her cannon, the 20mm rounds, chewing up sandbagged positions and sending more enemies running for cover. Good hits, Viper 1, came Morgan's voice. Enemy activity decreasing in sectors 1 and 2. But as Sarah set up for her third attack run, targeting the southern position that commanded the extraction landing zone, she heard the sound every pilot dreaded, the sharp beeping of radar lock-on warning. Missile launch, she called out, pulling into a hard defensive maneuver as a surface-to-air missile streaked past her canopy. The enemy had been hiding a SAM system that hadn't shown up in the intelligence reports. Sarah rolled into another valley, using the terrain to break the radar lock, then climbed rapidly to get a better view of the battlefield. She could see muzzle flashes from at least 6 different positions. The enemy had called in reinforcements and was setting up a deadly crossfire. Overwatch, Viper 1, she called. The situation has changed. Enemy has SAM capability and significant reinforcements. Extraction may not be feasible. Torres's voice came back immediately. Viper 1, the reconnaissance team is moving to the landing zone now. If we abort, they won't make it to another extraction point. Sarah understood. The trapped Americans were making their final move, using the distraction of her attacks to reach the pickup site. If she pulled back now, they would be caught in the open with no cover. She made her decision in seconds. Overwatch, continuing attack. Tell the extraction team they'll have their opening. What followed was some of the most dangerous flying of Sarah's career. She dove back into the valley, this time targeting the SAM site that had locked onto her. The Maverick missile found its mark, silencing the air defense system in a spectacular explosion. But the ground fire was intensifying. Small arms, rounds, and RPG rockets filled the air around her aircraft as she made pass after pass, systematically destroying enemy positions. Her fuel gauge was dropping rapidly from the high-power maneuvers, and she knew she was running out of time. Viper 1, extraction birds are inbound, came Torres's voice. 2 minutes out, Sarah could see the helicopters approaching from the west, 2 Blackhawks flying in formation, staying low to avoid detection. She also saw enemy fighters repositioning to engage the helicopters as they attempted to land. Not on my watch, she muttered, rolling into the most dangerous attack run of her life. Flying barely 50 feet above the valley floor, Sarah opened fire with everything she had. Cannon rounds, the last of her Maverick missiles, and finally her GPS-guided bombs all found their targets. The valley erupted in flames and smoke as enemy position after enemy position was destroyed. The helicopters landed in the cleared zone as Sarah pulled up and circled overhead, scanning for any remaining threats. She watched through her targeting pod as 6 figures ran from the tree line toward the waiting aircraft. the reconnaissance team, alive and moving under their own power. "Package secured," came the helicopter pilot's voice. "All souls on board." Sarah felt a surge of relief so intense it made her lightheaded. They had done it. Against overwhelming odds, with incomplete intelligence and a rapidly deteriorating situation, they had brought the Americans home. But her celebration was premature. As the helicopters lifted off and turned toward friendly territory, Sarah's low fuel warning light began blinking. The extended combat had consumed more fuel than planned, and she was still deep in enemy territory. "Overwatch, Viper 1, she called. "Mission complete. But I'm showing low fuel. May need tanker support for return to base." "Copy, Viper 1, Torres replied. "Tanker is already airborne and heading to Rendezvous Point Charlie." The flight to the tanker seemed to take forever. Sarah's fuel gauge dropped steadily as she climbed to altitude and turned toward the meeting point. She had enough fuel to make it, but just barely. There was no margin for error. When the KC-135 tanker appeared on her horizon like a guardian angel, Sarah had never been happier to see another aircraft. The aerial refueling went smoothly, and with full tanks again, she turned toward home. The sun was fully up by the time Sarah landed back at Kandahar Airfield. As she taxied toward her parking spot, she could see a crowd waiting on the tarmac. Word of the mission's success had spread throughout the base, and it seemed like half the personnel had turned out to welcome her back. Staff Sergeant Chen was there with tears in his eyes as she shut down the engine. Major Harrison stood nearby with a smile wider than she had ever seen. Even Colonel Peterson was present, along with what appeared to be most of the senior staff. But it was Captain Torres who approached first as Sarah climbed down from her aircraft. The tough SEAL captain, who had seen more combat than most people could imagine, looked at her with something approaching awe. "Captain Martinez," he said formally, then his voice softened. "Sarah, you did something extraordinary today. Those 6 men are alive because of your courage and skill." Sarah nodded, still processing what had happened. "They're our people, sir. We don't leave our people behind." Over the following days, the full scope of Sarah's achievement became clear. Intelligence reports revealed that she had single-handedly destroyed or disabled over 40 enemy positions, eliminated a sophisticated air defense system, and provided cover for a successful extraction under conditions that military analysts described as virtually impossible. The reconnaissance team she had saved included a Navy SEAL medic, 3 Army Rangers, and 2 intelligence specialists who had been gathering critical information about enemy movements. Their mission had provided data that would save countless other American lives in future operations. Major Harrison submitted Sarah for the Distinguished Flying Cross, one of the highest awards for aerial achievement. The citation would eventually read, "For extraordinary heroism while participating in aerial flight in connection with military operations against an armed enemy, Captain Martinez displayed exceptional courage and flying skill while conducting solo close air support operations in extremely hazardous conditions, directly resulting in the successful extraction of 6 American service members." But perhaps more importantly, Sarah's actions that day changed perceptions throughout the military about women in combat roles. Pilots who had questioned whether women belonged in fighter cockpits found their doubts erased. Ground troops who had been skeptical about female pilots now requested Viper by name for close air support missions. Lieutenant Commander Morgan, who had briefed her before the mission, later wrote in his after-action report, "Captain Martinez demonstrated tactical skill and combat leadership equal to any pilot I have worked with in 15 years of special operations." Gender was irrelevant. She was simply the right person for an impossible mission. Captain Torres went further. In a letter to the Pentagon reviewing policies for women in combat, he wrote, "The debate about women in combat is over. Captain Martinez didn't prove that women can fight as well as men. She proved that the best warrior available happened to be a woman, and we're lucky she was there when we needed her." For Sarah herself, the mission represented validation of everything she had worked for since childhood. She had faced the ultimate test of her skills and courage and emerged victorious. More importantly, she had brought 6 Americans home to their families. Standing on the tarmac that morning after her return, surrounded by colleagues who now saw her not as a female pilot trying to prove herself, but simply as a warrior who had answered the call when others could not. Sarah Martinez knew that she had found her place in military aviation. The little girl from Texas who had dreamed of flying had become the pilot who silently stood when the SEAL captain asked for volunteers, and in doing so, had shocked everyone, including herself, with just how far courage and skill could take someone willing to use them. The mission was over. But Sarah Martinez's legend was just beginning.